discussion.
But yes,
It
was one of the few cute campaigns we had, and now I find out we copied it too. So. Because we did it before the Bulgarians, so the Bulgarians took it from us, but apparently we took it from the Poles.
You know, there was a NATO plane and Serbia was bombed, and then one of the ads, one of the funny posters was, sorry, we didn't know it was invisible.
It's bad.
Very hardcore jokes, really, coming from that part of the world.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't know, you must know it in France, when they want to say when somebody is really drunk like hell, they would say Ivre comme un Polonais.
Ah. Yeah. There's something to it. Yeah?
Some English professor pointed that out to
Yeah.
me. Come from a shady area.
Did you see this piece of research that arguing that the Czech Republic is the most unhealthy country in the world and Afghanistan is the healthiest? Because the people are very fit there, no overweight people, you know, in Afghanistan, I mean. And the Czechs drink too much beer.
That's true.
A study on syphilis and the different names it has in different countries. Some countries
Oh my God,
it's
so
called
maybe
the
Rochkot.
French disease,
Mm.
and other countries, etc. This is always the other countries.
Sorry, I think that Professor Hroch called. Let me just... I hope the car came to pick him up.
So it is coming.
He's going to Prague today, and he has a car coming to pick him up. Ano, pane profesore, volal jste, já se omlouvám, já jsem asi mluvila s někým jiným. Přijelo auto, nebo ještě ne?
I looked in Strasbourg today, it's a marketing name.
Today is the sexy part.
Ježiš, to jste moc hodný, já jsem jenom viděla, že jste volal, tak moc se omlouvám, že tady nemohla být s vámi včera, protože jsem měla těžký opravdu den, ale bylo to pro mě opravdu podsta, že jsem mohla vás poznat a slyšet a moc vám děkuju. On měl ještě přijít ráno, pane profesore, ale on asi mu nebylo dobře. Já jsem viděla, že večer už mu bylo velmi špatně, takže teď jsem tady přišla, teďka jsem tady na konferenci a říkali mi, že tu nebyl včera. Takže on... Ne, on měl ráno být, ale to znamená, že mu asi nebylo dobře a zůstal v hotelu a potom odjel. No.
Samotność prezydenta. Samotność.
No, já bych vás, jestli chcete, já bych vám poslala jeho adresu a napsala bych vám mail oběma. Ano. Jo, já to zařídím. A já to zařídím, aby vám je poslali, jo? Ježiši, to jste hrozně hodnej, to určitě budou mít zájem a já to teďka tady řeknu a pošleme vám adresy. Ano. Tak moc, já vám to všechno pošlu a ještě taky pošlu e-mail vám a Tomasovi jako takový společný. Jo, tak jo, moc vám děkuju, pane profesore, moc vás zdravím, paní taky a doufám, že se uvidíme v Praze nebo někde jinde. Určitě. Určitě se ozvu. Určitě. Já moc děkuju, pane profesore. Šťastnou cestu. Děkuju, nashledanou. Ano, naschle. Okay, the car is there, it's good. The car picked up her. So should we start? Dorota is not here, so I think she will walk in. She says, "I'm 3 minutes. Start now." So
it was always 3 minutes.
It was always 3
Anyway.
minutes. If you allow me, is there anybody in the hallway or that we should call in? If not, then I'll okay, good. So it's a great pleasure for me to be back here today with you and to introduce our speaker, our keynote for the morning, Vyacheslav Mozorov from the University of Tartu in Estonia, who will be speaking about new nationalism and nationalisms and identity politics. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, and thank you for coming. As I said, the cream of the cream are here, and that's the most important in terms of the audience. Our conference focuses on new nationalisms, and they're defined in the program as, I'm sure I'm quoting Dorota here, discourses of effective mobilization propagating anti-EU and anti-immigration policies. And these are, according to the program, central to the phenomenon of non-liberal democracy. I'm not sure I completely agree with the use of the term and the definition, but we more or less know what we're talking about, right? So we agree on the phenomenon, and we also probably agree that it's sort of dangerous for democracy, for liberal democracy in particular. At the same time, we have been invited to confront new nationalisms with its opponent, the discourse of civic ethos and cosmopolitanism. Some people, I think, have tried to do that, but I don't think it has been really an overarching theme of the conference. I'm not sure I myself am prepared for that mission, but at the same time, I certainly do not want to question the importance of this task of, again, confronting new nationalisms. But what I would like to do in my talk is to draw your attention to one feature of new nationalisms which makes them more resilient, if you want, and more and stronger as ideologies, and therefore the task of confronting them more complicated. I will try to show that these discourses are very adroit, if you can put it this way, in exploiting the regime of truth established in liberal democratic societies. Their use of the language of democracy, human rights, and identity is sometimes hard to differentiate from the mainstream convention. And this mimicry is exactly what makes them hard to resist using liberal democratic vocabulary. I would even argue that the democracy, I mean, we have already, there have been people arguing here, Raul in particular, that right-wing populisms and even fascisms are not necessarily non-democratic. And I would even go a little bit further and say that contemporary new nationalisms are not necessarily completely illiberal. In some respects, at least, they might be seen as a hypertrophied version of liberalism, which then turns into its own negation. And this concerns, in particular, the obsession with identity and recognition, which is so typical of the late 20th, early 21st century liberal politics. And even more paradoxically, this obsession was originally promoted by the left-wing forces, more specifically by what used to be called, and probably still called, the cultural left. An important aspect here is that despite being majoritarian in the way it seeks democratic legitimacy, new nationalist discourse always makes use of the rhetoric of minority rights and minority protection. This is done by presenting the existing of our nation as threatened by overwhelming forces of neoliberal globalization embodied in the EU, the West, the Washington establishment, and so on. I would argue that there is no way of preventing the language of minority protection from being hijacked by predatory identities unless one foregrounds the universal dimension of equality and emancipation, as opposed to rights and entitlements associated with particular identities. The key political question today, as always, consists in how to navigate between totalitarian disregard of the local and the parochial concentration on the particular. Let me start by providing empirical evidence, or rather illustration, more entertaining than systematic, to support my initial claim, and then discuss its significance in more theoretical terms. Since in my research I focus on Russia, it's naturally easier for me to take the first example and the main example from the Russian context. I think it's also justified by the fact that Russia, in many respects, has been leading the way in this game of mimicry and the movement towards what we call new nationalisms. This game can also be called, of course, a game of appropriation. Appropriation of the originally left-wing agenda by authoritarian right-wing populists. As an illustration of this trend, I personally find the Pussy Riot case particularly instructive. And as background information for those of you who have already forgotten the details of the case, or perhaps were too young to follow it, Pussy Riot is a Russian feminist protest punk rock group based in Moscow, although now not just in Moscow, but increasingly also sort of globally and abroad and so on. It was founded in August 2011, and the group gained notoriety when its 5 members staged a performance inside Moscow's Cathedral of Church the Savior, the main church of the Moscow Patriarchy, on the 21st of February 2012. They were stopped by the church security officials, and the women said later that they were protesting against the Orthodox Church leaders' support for Vladimir Putin, who was then prime minister, running for president again. So they protested against the church involvement in politics, essentially. And 3 of the group members who were identified, because they were wearing masks, were arrested in March, and in August they were convicted of hooliganism motivated by religious hatred, and each was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. I don't want to discuss Pussy Riot's politics here, because, I mean, it's an interesting topic in itself, but I'm more interested in the reaction now and in the arguments of the prosecution in this case. And of course, this argument was also supported by the wider apparatus of state-controlled media. So, despite the fact that they were convicted of hooliganism, the 3 members of the band who actually went on trial were accused during the process of violating the rights of religious minorities and offending religious feelings. And the argumentative part of the verdict was very much based or structured around this argument. Also, it was this line of reasoning, offending religious feelings, was absolutely dominant in the societal discussion about the case. Also, of course, it then motivated the authorities or provided legitimacy to some new measures, restrictive measures, repressive measures, such as legislation against blasphemy and sacrilege and multiple moves de facto violating the principle of separation between the Orthodox Church and the state. This context in itself makes the case part of a long sequence of incidents arising from a clash between 2 norms: the freedom of expression on the one hand, and the rights of religious communities on the other hand. This sequence included, as you might remember, such cases as maybe already sort of historical, as the Muhammad cartoon controversy, the Innocence of Muslims film, the German circumcision law, and of course the later and eventually tragic chain of incidents centered on the Charlie Hebdo magazine. However, in the vast majority of such cases, the conflict was about the rights of religious minorities. As such, of course, they fall within the scope of original dilemmas faced by liberal democracies, with their inbuilt conflict between individual and group rights, as well as between particular interests and common good. So there is nothing unusual about them as such. What makes the Pussy Riot case especially revealing are 2 related aspects. I already mentioned that it was an instance of mimicry, but perhaps more importantly for today's topic, there was a revealing play with the democratic concept of majority rule on the one hand and the liberal principle of minority protection. It is evident that the multiculturalist norm invoked by the prosecution, the rights of religious minorities, was used in this case to protect a group dominant in the Russian society, the Orthodox Christians. It was often explicitly alleged in the debate, and this is the democratic argument actually, it was alleged that the ban offended the majority of the Russians. So, that should not be tolerated as such. This claim, of course, can be problematic on empirical grounds because far from all ethnic Russians are practicing Orthodox believers. Nevertheless, it is symptomatic of the overall situation, and it actually foreshadows one of the main rhetorical devices used by the new nationalists. They postulate a particular identity as universal. So they tell us that, okay, well, being Russian means being Orthodox. Belonging to the Russian people means being Orthodox. Or belonging to the Polish people means being Catholic and conservative and straight and so on. And this identity is allegedly shared by everyone. And then on behalf of this identity, political claims are made. So broadly speaking, this is a typical authoritarian populist move. It's nothing new. These moves have been made by populists throughout history. What is new is arguing the case on the basis of a liberal norm instead of using more explicit populist vocabulary of 20th century populists. For that matter, for instance, the Twitter president, who is not to be named, is a more classical case of invoking sort of people against the elites. So basically, instead of serving to defend disenfranchised minorities, as the original multiculturalist idea certainly did, this liberal norm was inverted to reaffirm the hegemonic position of one particular cultural group, in this case, Orthodox Russians. But what happens next is even more interesting. When confronted with the above objection that the norm is and was intended to protect minorities, not the majority, Russian opponents of secularism would immediately take a defensive stance, and they would refer to the global context in which their struggle takes place. They would argue that even though Orthodox Christians constitute a majority within Russia, they still remain a minority in the globalizing world, a world where the aggressive presence of the West plays a defining role. So Pussy Riot's action would be presented as only one, even if particularly aggressive, manifestation of pro-Western secularism, which undermines local cultures and thus threatens the existence of non-Western communities. So as a result, in their eyes, the Pussy Riot incidents demonstrates the urgent need to protect Orthodox Christianity, along with other religions considered as organic to Russia, against malevolent atheism, postmodernism, whatever you may call it. In a further step, paradoxical maybe, but not at all inconsistent, cultural protectionism would appeal to the Western norm once again, by saying that similar laws guaranteeing religious rights also exist in the West. And of course, they in the first place, they would quote Germany when it comes to particularly Pussy Riot and religious minorities. And these references, of course, serve a dual purpose. On the one hand, they reaffirm the universality of the norm protecting particular identities. Yes, everyone does it. On the other hand, they reiterate the thesis about moral insolvency of the West. In this view, the Western leaders and media use the universal norm in the most instrumental fashion, with the aim of subduing non-Western nations. So when it suits the West to enhance its power, the West would invoke the norm of minority protection. When it doesn't suit this goal, the West would, for instance, call for the protection of the freedom of speech and so on. Now a little bit of theoretical reflection, and of course along the neo-Gramscian lines. I think this problem as such is, if you put it in the more abstract terms, is not really, again, unique, and it's typical of hegemonic universality. Let me explain what I mean here. So first of all, in Gramscian terms, hegemony is a certain type of power or a certain type of order, if you want, and it emerges when a particular identity succeeds in establishing itself as universal. The classical example, which Gramsci, of course, was focusing on, is a situation described already by Marx, when capitalist order is successfully presented as something natural. You know, market is human nature, basically, and free play of the market, free competition, free relations between the capital and between capital and labor. This is all something natural for human beings. This is how we exist. It's a direct expression of human nature, and as such, when the workers buy into this description, they become sort of limited in their options. They have to consent. They have to agree that, yeah, this is how it works. And we probably have to fight for wages, but that we have to fight within the system as such. In our case, what happens is that the logic of liberal hegemony on the global scale establishes an essential link between universal humanity as an abstract idea and the concrete reality of the West, particular reality. And of course, what makes this link essential is not some sort of necessary relationship. There is no necessary relationship between Western democracy and humanity as an abstract idea, but rather the absence of alternative definitions of the universal. There is no one so far, well, maybe the Islamists, but that's again, the appeal is limited so far. But otherwise, no one has been able to come up with an alternative definition of the universal. So in this situation, we inevitably turn to the actually existing Western incarnations of the universal as sort of the only way the universal can exist. As a result, Russian society, as many other peripheral societies, faces the perennial choice, either to Westernize and become, normal by imitating the West, or to defend one's own particular identity, defend the difference. And this is what the opponents of Western universalism actually do. And of course, since the last round of Westernization failed in the 90s, then Russia started again to search for some sort of authentic version of universal values that would be rooted in Russian historical experience and so on. And again, this search has been unsuccessful, I would argue, and we can talk about this if you want in Q&A. But I have argued about this in a number of publications, that since 2012, what Russia has been looking for, it was actually an alternative version of universality, but what it has found so far is just a mirror image of the West, and which is then negated, right? There is a certain West which is imagined, liberal, gay, whatever, postmodern, and then it is negated, and the Russian identity is built on this negation. Mm-hmm. So it becomes homophobic, it becomes orthodox, it becomes family-centered, conservative, and so on. There is nothing there beside beyond the negation. And of course, if you have to put up resistance, if you want to protect the difference without the real difference, mm-hmm. then you have to use the language of hegemony. You have to use the language, for instance, of liberal rights and the liberal language of minority protection. But simultaneously you invert it. You simply say that, okay, well, we are the ones who really protect the minorities, and the West is actually, what the West is trying to achieve is global dominance. And this, I think, is a very important illustration of how hegemonic universality, which is always imperfect, there is always a residual trace of particularity in any type of hegemonic universality, how it works in the periphery. I mean, it's okay. I think it's important to maintain that hegemonic universality is achievable, and it's it's important to defend universal values even if they are rooted in the particular reality of the West, because we don't have any other universality to base our claims on. But at the same time, we should be very sensitive to how it plays out in the periphery, because in the periphery, there is this very complex interplay of the universal and the particular, which eventually often leads to the inversion of this universal norm. And of course, there are other examples. The Hungarian and the Polish case are all too obvious here. And I would also argue that in the Brexit case, for instance, there was a similar development where even the Brits felt somehow colonized by the EU. Also in the literal sense, because of migrants, you know, like people moving and changing our way of life. But on a more general note, and a more sort of intellectual history note, what these examples demonstrate is that the embrace of the cultural agenda by the left in the 1970s and 80s was an enormously risky move. I would even go as far as to say that as of this day, on the balance, this move was self-destructive for the West, for the left, sorry. Under the circumstances, this move was perhaps inevitable because, as I already mentioned in one of the discussions, starting from the 70s, Marxist theory was facing, and to some extent it is still facing, two formidable challenges. The first one was the fact that global class structures were undergoing a profound change. Labor got immersed in a web of relations within the capitalist society, such as collective bargaining, welfare, pensions, and so on, which eventually meant that the reproduction of the working class itself was subsumed under the capitalist mode of production. And this, in turn, rendered the classical Marxist scenario of universal emancipation through proletarian revolution highly implausible. The workers were no longer a revolutionary class, and they probably ceased to be a class at all, as a distinct class identity, or perhaps non-identity in the Marxist terms, right? And the resulting crisis was exacerbated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, at the moment when neoliberalism was on the rise, and then the neoliberal hegemony that resulted. And the search for the way of coming to terms with this challenge produced the second challenge, the proliferation of ontological pluralism in what used to be a relatively solid ground of Marxist theory. The emergence of the new cultural, new social movements. They were no longer happy with the agenda of class struggle. Instead, or in addition to the issues of class, they brought to the fore oppression rooted in patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and so on. And Nancy Fraser demonstrated as far back as 1995 that while the traditional Marxist agenda was an agenda of redistribution, the new agenda was an agenda of recognition. And the two demands were obviously related. There is no question about that. But it was impossible to reduce one to the other. So for classical Marxists, the ontology was rooted, their ontology was rooted in the relations of production and class struggle as a manifestation of the fundamental contradictions inherent in the base, in the productive part of society. And for the cultural left, of course, the cultural left saw the world as a patchwork of disparate, overlapping identities rooted in the domain of the ideational as well as the material. So politics of recognition has been astonishingly successful, actually. And there is no denial that, in principle, it was progressive. Because it did bring to the fore a number of groups and identities which were silent and absolutely ignored, had been ignored before this turn to the politics of recognition. However, this agenda contained a conservative kernel, which was not, I think, properly reflected upon. And this eventually led to a contamination of the entire discursive field, opening it up for the colonization on the part of the right. And this conservative kernel consisted precisely in defining the subject of emancipation in cultural terms. In the final analysis, the mission of such a subject was to defend or recover a fullness of being associated with, say, blackness or womanhood or indigeneity or gayness or any other particular type of existence or being. This fullness has allegedly been lost or impaired because of slavery, patriarchy, colonization, homophobia, and so on. And the complaint was that one's identity has been violated from the outside. And this is a particularist complaint. And at some stage, if it is pressed too hard, it inevitably parts ways with universalist demands for human emancipation. The popular identity that it strives to defend is framed in organicist terms. There are always identities which are good and those which are bad. So it's good to be gay, it's good to be a woman, but a straight white man is already under suspicion somehow. I mean, I'm exaggerating here slightly, but only slightly. And if you look at the cultural wars going on on the US campuses, that's probably the best illustration of how far this agenda can be taken. Also consider the claim which is often made in political science and especially in IR on behalf of feminism, that women somehow, if women participate more in politics, politics will become better. Well, this is what I call wrong feminism, because it doesn't foreground equality. It actually claims that some identities are better than others. And what it does, actually, it inverts the relationship between the master and slave in Hegelian dialectics. It basically the slave who becomes the master and becomes the new oppressor, instead of destroying the relationship as such, the oppressive relationship, and liberating not just himself, but also the master, in a way. Okay, well, I have to cut it short, but let me just say that we really need to go back to the more classical universalist agenda. But of course, at the same time, we should avoid the dogmatism of certain versions of Marxism, especially Soviet Marxism, which runs into exactly the same trap. When it starts to identify emancipation not with the abstract idea of the proletarian as a non-identity, as a class which doesn't have property and therefore is not rooted in the capitalist order, right? And therefore becomes revolutionary and is the subject of universal emancipation. But it associates emancipation with the really existing workers as an identity, as a positive identity. And this was actually a betrayal of the idea of communist revolution. This failure eventually led to the extreme violence of the Russian Civil War and the eventual establishment of the Stalinist dictatorship. And again, my argument should not be taken as a denial of the reality of the oppression, which of course is often based on culturally embedded difference. My own inspiration in search for the solution would come once again from the neo-Gramscian tradition, especially from Ernesto Laclau. And in his theory of populist politics, which he introduced already in his first major book in 1997 and developed through the rest of his life, Laclau puts the emphasis on the political demand as such, a self-grounded political move which invokes the universality of the people. So the key difference between authoritarian right-wing populism and what Laclau presents as true populism is the following one. Authoritarian populists already know what the people are and how the real people should look like. They can be workers, they can be Catholic, they can be straight, they can be whatever. They can be even gay, it doesn't matter in this case. But they somehow, in advance, define what the people should look like. And in the name of these artificially constructed people, they would then address the really existing demands and discontents. They would tell us, okay, well, you are being oppressed, you feel dissatisfied, your salaries are low, you are out of job because of the migrants. Because you are white and these migrants are black and Muslim and they actually take your jobs. For instance, because there is patriarchy and men are essentially oppressive and bad, and women should have more representation in politics. I mean, the second demand, under the circumstances, is definitely more progressive on a relative scale, but I think it's still flawed in the sense that it foregrounds a particular identity which eventually leads to inversion, as I showed in the Pussy Riot case. So, yeah, I'm finishing. And I would argue that there is no way to fight this formidable opponent, the right-wing authoritarian populism, other than by prioritizing the universal over the particular, the equality over identity. Of course, we must be very careful to make sure we listen to demands made on behalf of particular identities, because, as I said, most forms of oppression, today more than ever, have a cultural dimension. However, as the subaltern keeps speaking only in their own name, only in the name of their identities, they remain essentially voiceless. The only chance they have is becoming oppressors themselves. But more often than not, the privileged will simply usurp their voice. And progressive politics, therefore, cannot consist in constantly affirming one's own identity. What is required instead is being broad popular alliances between diverse political forces, ready to accommodate new demands as these emerge from the bottom up. Progressive politics must remain concrete, because otherwise it would degenerate in authoritarian populism, but it also must foreground equality for everyone and oppose particular privileges. If there ever has been time for women's politics, black politics, native politics, and so on, this time is more or less over. All these noble causes can be advanced only by equating women's politics with black politics, with native politics, with worker politics, and so on, and eventually arriving at people's politics as the only genuinely democratic solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vyacheslav. This was fantastic. Very, very inspirational, at least for me. So I'm opening the floor to questions, comments. We have time. So maybe I will, yeah, there is. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation. I completely agree with everything you did.
That's why there are no comments.
What else is there to say?
But there is a but. I think I completely agree with the analysis. My question is, and I completely agree with the solution of this broad popular alliances. Again, what you described, if I think of the interwar period, it's quite similar in many respects. And the broad popular alliances were what eventually defeated fascism. It was the only way to defeat fascism. That's Hobsbawm argues that I completely agree with him. And but how do you mobilize them? Because they were especially difficult to mobilize in the interwar period. And back then we didn't have this proliferation of identity politics. We didn't have all these subalterns speaking in different terms. It was more or less 2-3 main games: socialism, liberalism, conservatism, so on. What I find as a difficulty is to mobilize this broad popular identities that people understood broadly, and I completely agree with defining this proletarian identity as a negative, as a non-identity. But in practical terms, this leads to the difficulty of practically mobilizing such things. And also, to some extent, because the field has been so overcharged. What you were saying earlier, and I see this with the left today, that the left was a self-destructing move, because it's now looking for a proletarian that doesn't exist, looking for the perfect proletarian who is not sexist, not homophobic, not racist, not nationalist, and these persons might exist in a minority, usually among academia, but they are existing from the streets. They're not real. They are an abstraction. And as long as the left is dead centered on finding this individual, this subject of this emancipated subject as a basis for emancipating the rest of the subjects, it's going to fail, because you can't find such an individual except for black minorities. So how do you mobilize on the basis of what? What do you give up of this universalism? Because you have to give up something. Again, positing a new universalism is bound to do what the liberalism has done, claiming that it's neutral. only reinforces the, I mean, it's something particular that claims to be neutral. Liberalism claims to be a playing field, and that's how it became universal, but it was obviously charged with political values in the West. That's the broader question. And the smaller one, how would you reflect on Brexit? Because you mentioned it there, and it's interesting to me because historically Britain was the birthplace of the West. So I would be interested how you think this plays out in the case of Britain, this rejection of the Western model for the country that generated it.
Okay, thank you. Shall I?
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
as you want.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, of course, mobilization, I mean, generally speaking, and that's where Laclau probably differs from Gramsci, and I would even more differ from Laclau, because Laclau is still a radical thinker. And he prioritizes sort of revolutionary politics, radical politics, over normal democratic politics. I think that in normal democratic circumstances, and he describes it in his book on populist reason very well, demands get accommodated within the system. They get processed within the existing institutional system, and there is nothing wrong with that from my perspective. Laclau might be a bit unhappy about that because he's for this kind of revolutionary shake-up normally. But what we are facing today is what Gramsci described an organic crisis, I think. And this is evident from the fact that populism becomes so dominant, so prominent, so widespread and emerges everywhere, that demands actually get frustrated in the system. The democratic system anywhere, nowhere is capable of normally sort of accommodating demands, satisfying them, because it's simply deaf. It doesn't hear what the people say. Somehow, in most countries in the West, and in a different way in Russia, for instance, the system has become detached from the people, and that's a symptom of organic crisis. And that's why you have politicians like Trump on the one hand and Navalny on the other hand, who are all populists. They actually make demands in the name of the people, presenting a particular agenda, sometimes a concrete agenda. In Navalny's case, it's the fight against corruption. In Trump's case, it's God knows what, but something still, against the establishment. The question is, how do you fight against these guys? How do you actually ensure the politics of real representation as opposed to the fake representation that the populists offer, the right-wing authoritarian populists offer? And I think the only way to do it is bottom-up. I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic about what's going on in Russia right now on the local politics level. Because if you probably didn't notice, but at the last elections this month, in Moscow, for instance, local elections, they yielded several local councils in which United Russia doesn't have a single seat, the governing party. And in several others, there is an oppositional majority. In Moscow, which has always been tightly controlled, and all those so-called political technologies were deployed with full power, they still did not manage to do anything. And it means that local discontents can actually transform into actual political achievements. And then what is important, of course, is again building alliances, explaining to people that, okay, well, your local politics is, for instance, about this particular park which is being sort of cut down in order to build yet another building, residential building, and produce even more traffic congestion and so on. But look on the other side of the highway, and there might be another local politics which is about a kindergarten which has been converted into a shopping mall or something like that. This is the only way of building it from bottom up. And eventually, of course, this should lead to a broader agenda which has to fight homophobia, for instance, which has to ensure that feminist agenda remains there, and so on. But there is no way of doing it, without actually interacting with people. You have to have an agenda. You have to have an ideology. Probably you have to have a debate. And it's an intellectual task in the first place. This is why I was, in my intervention in discussions, I was emphasizing intellectual leadership. But at the same time, you have to get your hands dirty. And this is what many people are doing, actually. I know quite a few young people in Russia who are academics, sociologists for the most part, or anthropologists. And then they actually do engage in local politics. They are very active, and they're doing a great job, I think. And there is no way of defeating Trump by simply debating, with him on the TV, because it's simply impossible to present the wide agenda that the people might have by debating on the most general level. It has to be concrete. It has to be bottom up. And then if you have this mass support in certain clusters, then how it can develop further, I think. This is how I would see it. So on the one hand, intellectual work, which needs to think concretely, but at the same time keep the universal agenda in mind. And on the other hand, really dealing with people's needs and demands. This is the other side of the matter. And on Brexit, well, basically, I think that, well, in a way, this is again, obviously it's a problem of democracy, right? So Brexit was a democratic move in a way. It was a decision taken by the people who were dissatisfied and felt disenfranchised in this whole system of liberal democracy, which offered so much but actually delivered so little. Then it's this dissatisfaction, which is again hijacked by the populists who offer to you a certain vision of Britain as, again, white, maybe working class, kind of common, cozy, old school, old time Britain, which is no longer there because of the immigrants. And why the immigrants are there? Because the EU is imposing all these immigration rules, and also the EU is imposing all these trade rules, and we have to obey stupid regulations from Brussels, and we don't want to do that, but we have to because we're part of the EU. We're no longer, we're no longer in control with the people. So it's the same scheme, the same mechanism, which is at work elsewhere. And it doesn't really matter. The tradition doesn't matter because this tradition is, I mean, it's not entirely alien to the people. But I think what happens here is that people imagine themselves as being somehow different, somehow more authentic than this whole Enlightenment liberal intelligentsia, which is so urbanized and so, all those, how did they put it, bicycle riding vegetarians who are trying to promote things which are irrelevant for us. So we are more genuine, we are more democratic, we are more real, we are the people, and they are, something which is superficial and doesn't really have roots. And this is then associated with the EU in this case. And I think in the Polish and the Hungarian case, this is also what happens to a large extent. In the Russian case, it's simply associated with the West, in Europe and the US, and this is all lumped together. But it doesn't really matter because the conflict is always externalized. That's the main point here. It's not an internal conflict within society. There is someone from the outside who is dictating the agenda to us. That is the common mechanism here.
We don't have much more time, but if you agree, we are supposed. This next session is supposed to start at 11:05, which is in 12 minutes. If we all agree to a short break with coffee maybe brought here, then we can go on for another 5-7 minutes. And then is that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So, Bogdan, Dorota, I'd like to ask something. Anybody else? Can we collect maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Bogdan, go ahead. And let's be short in the...
I'll try, yes, because this is so stimulating, really.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I'm amazed at how well you put it, this served perfectly for my one-on-one cultural studies class, where I'm doing exactly the same thing. I'm trying to say that the left has to recycle all its power asymmetries from class to other sorts of cultural identities. riot prosecution case. Would you say there are several levels of hypocrisy involved in such maneuvering? You're comparing it with Trump, who is supposedly more sincere about it. Perhaps there's one level of hypocrisy that talks about the interest of the people, the general interest of the people, but really you're focusing on your self-interest, right? You're just using that to promote yourself. And that's one of the levels. The other level is how open or disguised your chauvinism is, right? The fact that you're openly chauvinistic about certain groups doesn't mean that you're less hypocritical, or okay, that's what I'm trying to say. And then your fabulous discussion of the universal versus particular values. We don't have a definitive definition of the universal, perhaps we could replace that, because you will never have one, and then how do you work with the universal when you don't have the definition? Could we perhaps renounce the idea that we could have a perfect universal working perfectly, not just a definition, but a perfect reality called the universal, and instead go for a practical version of the universal that is testable, for instance, right? You have certain values that are not really self-serving, your particular interests, but they can be applied to someone else, right? I don't know, is it better to uphold religious rights or to be religiously intolerant? It's an easy decision, right? More people are going to benefit from being tolerant than intolerant, right? So, I don't know, that might be a very practical, not very sophisticated solution to it. And then you were talking about peripheries, right? To uphold universality, but be careful about how it plays out in the peripheries, right? But the U.S., Trump issue, all the other extremist discourses, intolerant discourses are not peripheries, right? So perhaps we should concentrate on periphery in geographic terms, right? And possibly one last question. You're invoking Lacan and you're casually asserting authoritarian populism as authoritarian right-wing populism. Is that the only kind? Is that the only possibility? Can you have an authoritarian left-wing populism as well? Because then you're turning this into a particularist versus universalist, right? Turn universalist. Okay, then I'll stop. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Donata?
So I'll try to be brief. Thank you first of all, Nationalisms, for giving us, at least me, names and phrases and terms for a lot of things that I have been intuiting, and many of us perhaps, but you gave us some very precise forms to contain those intuitions into. Okay, so I like this idea of the broad lines of forces from the grassroots level, and that you say that an ideology is needed as well at this, let's say, some level up. Ideology that sometimes perhaps, I remember reading one of George Lakoff's essays on politics that where he would, I think, replace the idea of ideology with ethos, which is not the same term, obviously, but here you have a similar agenda to offer some kind of an umbrella of concepts that can bring this alliance into being. Obviously, the question would be how to do it. And I'm particularly grateful to you for this underlying the reflexiveness of recognition politics, as well as in nationalism, which is also recognition politics in a way. And it's because as a reflexive discourse, it's ultimately powerless. If we take into account, for example, the whole discussion of the place of women in solidarity movement, in the 80s, all the women who were decisive in the solidarity movement underground were, felt like that, to a large extent, hurtful. Yeah, they ran journals, they were making decisions and so on. 90s came, especially with some airborne groups of American feminists, and they were told that they were in fact powerless. Their contribution was meaningless because they were not recognized as women. So a huge discussion started, and now any scholar writing on women's role in the solidarity movement has to reflect on this powerlessness in response to, I think, a very colonizing discourse from outside on how feminist consciousness, feminine consciousness should look like, because what was before was wrong and not feminist, and etc. Even though before all this, I thought that, okay, most women worked, they went to work willingly, they were not forced, although obviously the new discourse was they worked because they had to, and so on and so forth. So up until now, instead of producing books and discussions on this feminine force in the underground that has a very long tradition, they do come up, but always in response to this charge of it wasn't recognized by men. If it wasn't recognized by men, obviously we had a backlash afterwards, a backlash of patriarchy and so on in the 90s. But instead of bringing up forceful discourse, it was reflexive, weak in fact. And we could have many other examples, but this is, I think, the most typical, because I think it started also with a forceful implantation of a discourse from the outside. It was quite artificial at the beginning, and then it was again somehow, naturalized.
Thank you.
One more.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No? Yes, go
No? You sure?
No, it's good.
Okay, good. I'll pass two so that you could
Okay,
just be really
just
1 minute.
quickly, yeah.
1.5 minute to answer 10
all right,
minutes of
all right.
questions.
Then I would agree simply with Bogdan on inversion. I mean, there is more to discuss here, but yes, I agree that it's multi-layered. And actually, I was trying to show it, but of course, you need a more extended analysis to explicate the details of that. Practical version of the universal one, in a way, what Laclau offers is a practical version of the universal. And you know what actually I think what is necessary here is exactly this idea that it's one thing when you argue that you demand recognition as, let's say, a gay person, and full stop. The other thing is that you demand recognition and respect as a gay person because you want equal respect for everyone. This equal respect for everyone is a crucial thing here. And this is what may be called a practical version of the universal. Because once you foreground equality, you immediately universalize your claim. Because it's not just you who are being oppressed, but it's everyone, but everyone is oppressed in their own way. And that's what is important. Trump, I mean, it's not just geographical periphery, obviously. I mean, the flyover states are in the same way peripheral, maybe, as many other places in the world. And in that sense, of course, Trump is addressing a periphery in a certain sense. But of course, yes, he's addressing it from the core of the core. And this is what makes this phenomenon...
National periphery, not international.
I don't know to what extent. I mean, national and international are all connected. And in that sense, of course, Moscow, in a sense, can be described as part of the core. Whereas, if you drive 100 kilometers away from Moscow, maybe 200 kilometers, or 30 kilometers away from St. Petersburg, and you are already in the global periphery, which is very, very peripheral and very poor and destitute and so on. So that's also a question. Left-wing populism, authoritarian populism, I think is possible, but I mean, what I see as left, as the essence or the terminological gist of the left, I think is something that should avoid essentialization as such. It's what I see as the essence of the left is anti-essentialism. And then it cannot be, anti-essentialism I don't think can be authoritarian. It can be maybe powerless in some cases. But anyway, this is a big question.
Dorota.
I would differentiate between ideology and ethos, because ethical politics sometimes is conservative politics, and it's...
I do mean ethics and then ethos as
Ethos,
something.
okay, ethos. Well, ideology is more concrete in my view. Ethos is something that you have, you know, as a person, but
Do you have
ideology...
an idea what it could be, this ideology?
No, but it should be concrete. Ideology should be, you know, you look at the situation on the ground and you describe in this concrete ideological platform, if you want, or program, how you implement your universal values in this concrete situation. This is what I would call ideology. Because ideology, of course, is a partial description of the world, right? When you select certain elements as most important, you sort of take from this inherent limitless diversity of being some elements which are essential, which you see as essential, and you sort of relate your vision of the universal to these specific particular elements. And this is what differentiates ideology from ethos, which I think remains at the level of the universal and abstract. And thank you for this example of women in solidarity. I can only answer with a counterexample of women in the Soviet dissident movement, which was actually, at least initially, very male-dominated and very patriarchal. And there are works on the Soviet dissident movement which actually demonstrate how this whole discourse of technical intelligentsia, from which the dissidents actually very much originated, how it was dismissive of women and how women were actually positioned as sort of inferior and, you know, like as someone who was supposed to provide services to those great men who were fighting in the name of universal human rights and so on. But this example is actually very interesting about women in the solidarity movement and how then it got reframed and so on. It's from my perspective, it's fascinating, and I agree that it's a very relevant example. It's very important here, and I think it needs to be explored further and put in a wider context. So I'll probably stop here.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and
Thank you.
we have no minutes, so so just if you could grab coffee and come back, okay? Sorry about not being disciplined, but it was very interesting.